So this is a retrofit information support and expertise event, which is fully funded by the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero and delivered by Turner and Townsend.
We're just going to kind of roughly cover lessons learned from our time running a consortium for SHDF Waves 1 and 2, things like tailoring, consortium agreements, steps for mobilisation, consortium delivery model, meetings, procurement, knowledge sharing, changes to delivery, staying agile, and finances at the end, and also value add. So quite a lot to cover, but I'll do my best. So a little bit about us. As I say, my name's Laura. I'm project manager at the Combined Authority. I joined the LCRCA in April 2023, so coming up to 2 years. And I immediately was assigned to SHDF Wave 1, and I've not left the Housing Partnerships team since. Chris?
Yep, afternoon everyone. Chris, and since joining the Combined Authority, I've been delivering the LAD programmes and also putting together bids for SHDF previous waves, right in the middle at the moment of preparing for SHF Wave 3.
Thank you. And we won't go into tons of detail, but just to give a bit of an overview of, I guess, the number of schemes that the CA is involved in. This is a kind of programmes on a page. So as I mentioned, we've run with SHDF Wave 1, Hug 1, LAD 2, LAD 3. As you can see there, there's some asked to pay schemes sold together. As Chris mentioned, looking ahead, Wave 3, Social Housing Fund, local grant. Yes, so a lot to contend with. And so just to give you some high level figures, we've participated in 6 schemes since 2021. Currently, we've got 6 ongoing or planned schemes, which total over 31,000 properties. That's obviously estimate and does change as things progress. So we've completed over 5,000 homes, and the capital spend is around 57.1 million for activities so far. So that's just a little bit about the CA and kind of what we've been involved in. And the kind of purpose, I guess, of this webinar is to talk about lessons learned and, you know, what we've kind of established in our time on the schemes that we've participated in. So I've kind of high level given a mix of things that we've improved already and things we've identified as improvements for the future. So I'll refer back to these high level themes as we move through the agenda and share some more specific lessons as well. But these are broadly kind of some key themes that we've picked out. So tailoring, a kind of really important thing that we've learned is to build on the DESNZ processes and adapt them to suit a consortium or to suit your consortium. So obviously DESNZ have set processes that we will adhere to, but it's about how you manage it with your housing providers. So like things like reporting and managing change, you know, tailoring it to suit. So I'll get into that a little bit more later. Second point is to really scrutinise the DESNZ kind of reporting and submission requirements. So distilling things down for housing providers. I guess it's about that kind of the role that the consortium plays in that. Things can be quite confusing. Obviously, providers have limited capacity as well, and many different roles who, you know, people are allocated to the scheme. So some elements of templates are confusing for non-grant recipients. So like, for example, how much of the spend is categorized as grant each month. I'll get into that in a little bit more detail coming up, but basically just understanding what processes and information and templates are for the consortium, what can be tailored for housing providers and what can be passed straight up, and flexible support, obviously things like meeting frequency, completion of templates. Every housing provider, as I say, is different size, different structure, different budget. So like tailoring and adapting to the needs of the housing provider and asking for feedback and kind of just understanding their needs and tailoring to suit. I think something that for Wave 3 in particular, bringing together smaller housing providers and then you know, offering more support from a consortium point of view for them, because it's a big overhead, and for a small provider with limited and multi-role staff, it's obviously easier for us to support more in populating kind of essential documents. So then the next kind of key theme is compliance. So the grant funding agreement is the core document, and just making sure that everything is appropriately formalised. We've obviously got a legal department in the CA, so that's really, really helpful. We can consult with them when it's necessary and make sure everything is totally above board. We're also can provide assurance support. We're an additional set of eyes on everything, on all the data, on all of the properties and the measures, the plans, everything like that. It's just that kind of extra layer where we can really add value, and also quality checking. So the consortiums are filtered both ways. So we're rolling up information from housing providers and making sure that, you know, there's a quality output there. I think some of them we've learned is that just directly rolling up and then sending off straight away is not going to produce quality information. It's about reviewing everyone's inputs and supporting people to getting it right, basically. And then finally, value add. So I kind of mentioned, but you know, what is our role in this and how can we provide the best support and how we can be of most use? So facilitating consortium discussions. So we have a lot of lessons learned, workshops, deep dives, making sure that we're celebrating success as well, knowledge sharing, sharing templates, sharing documents, sharing innovative ideas, resident engagement, like a whole host of things. I think that's huge value of being in the consortium. Sharing risks and opportunities. So it's kind of like a safety net, whereas some providers may be behind, then some will be ahead, and it kind of smooths out the overall status, you know, of the consortium as a whole. It allows for wiggle room, and also, you know, where one consortium member may be having to de-scope because of various reasons, there's always another consortium member who has got capacity and budget to take on board additional work. So that works brilliantly. And finally, training, events, wider industry contacts, networking, you know, there's that whole side of things as well. There's a huge number of people all working on the same thing, so there's so much sharing that goes on and passing on of information and all that kind of thing as well. And so there are kind of high level lessons learned. To deep dive on a couple of those lessons. So tailoring with regards to reporting. So the monthly data upload, it isn't always suitable for housing providers to complete. So we've got 14 housing providers in Wave 2.1, and we drop all of the totals into one consortium template. And as I say, just kind of rolling that up directly will very likely give you a poor quality or inaccurate report, because there's lots of different interpretations and categories. And as I say, you know, there's different levels of experience, different roles from housing providers who are allocated to the project. So this is just our kind of process for reporting. So as I say, we kind of collate one view. So there's elements on the monthly report that ask for how much the housing provider has spent in grant. Now, they can't really say that. They can say how much they've spent in total. But as you can see in this process, that the housing providers claim from us their grant element. So we are the ones who specify how much grant they are eligible for based on property lodgement. So the elements here that I'm circling is basically confusing for housing providers to populate. It just goes in as a kind of estimate, and it's not accurate and it's not useful, and retrospectively we should have stripped it out. So a better approach would be for the consortium to own and have complete control over the one single report which is submitted every month, but share like a stripped back report for housing providers to populate with only the required information. So yeah, I think, you know, looking at this again, we would definitely really spend some time with the report and say what is for us, what is for housing providers. There are also kind of tabs to do with risk and fraud, which absolutely will and should be populated. But is that how we want to present that request to housing providers, using those tabs, or do we actually want to kind of work it all on our end and then, you know, quality check it and sense check it, and then, you know, rather than giving them the direct template? So other DESNZ reports and I guess areas to kind of streamline for housing providers that we've established. As I say, risk, we tend to just capture that in one-to-ones verbally on a separate log, play that back to housing providers. You know, I am a project manager by trade, but nobody else is, basically. Like, you know, housing providers have all those various roles, so it may be second nature for me, but it's not for other people. So it makes sense for me to kind of capture those risks in the correct format and then play back and roll up. And as I say again, you know, fraud the same. I'd guess presenting with a complex fraud template to complete is a bit overwhelming and confusing. So it's easier to kind of walk through with the providers and then help them to capture it and just play it back for approval. Okay, so next topic on the kind of compliance theme is consortium agreements. So there are lots of different documentations that we kind of agree with DESNZ and we agree with housing providers, and I guess it's just kind of working out which documents are formal and which can be done informal, and applying the right level of kind of scrutiny and governance on them. So there's core consortium documentation, and I've kind of done a bit of an overview of which ones that we use. So we do have a collaboration agreement ahead of grant funding agreements being signed off. So this is, I suppose, like an informal sign up and buy into the spirit of the program is a good way to put it. So we kind of use a lot of the wider combined authority ambition, net zero ambitions in that, and ensure that the housing providers are bought into the strategic priorities, making them aware of the guidance, the kind of aspiration for collaboration and knowledge sharing as part of the scheme. It's just a kind of like vision, and it just also gives like confidence for budgets and co-funding availability, and just a bit of like mobilization pre-GFA. So it lays a good foundation. So we do that, but it's not a formal document. Then we've obviously got the grant funding agreement between DESNZ and the consortium. So this doesn't change throughout the project lifecycle, and everything, all of the legal documentation hangs off the back of it. So a key thing for me is that I've really come to understand is, if you're in any doubt, always refer back to the GFA. That is the one document that, it's set in stone. So then obviously we create grant funding agreements with each housing provider as well off the back of the consortium GFA. So this breaks down each individual housing provider scope and financial profile. And a major lessons learned for us on this one is that what the housing providers put in their GFA with us is sort of supersedes the scheme guidelines in a sense. What I mean by that is, for example, if in the guidelines for the scheme, there was a minimum grant spend requirement of 40% in financial year 1. But if a housing provider does their own planning and comes to the conclusion that they are going to spend or aim to spend 60% of their grant allocation of the consortium in financial year 1, that is then their target, because all of those individual targets are rolled up to create our overall target, which we then provide the DESNZ, and then we are held to that. So I suppose it's that thing of like all of the individual housing providers, it's all the component parts that are then collated and go up into a kind of consortium plan. But yeah, as I say, there's the scheme guidelines, which is a minimum. But if a housing provider decides that they're going to spend more than that and they lock that plan in, that forms part of the bigger plan, and then they will be held to that. So very, very important lesson from that, because obviously if housing providers miss that target, it puts the grant spend at risk because the overall spend will dip too low. But yeah, so both GFAs between DESNZ and us and consortium and RPs are formal documents signed off by legal and signed off on the housing provider side as well. Then obviously, we've got deeds of variation when things change, which they inevitably will. So variations to the original grant funding agreement between us, the consortium, and housing providers could be like properties measures or spend grant allocation. So a major lesson learned on this for me as well was there is a kind of change control process that's set by DESNZ, but as a consortium, we do have the ability to kind of plug in individual housing provider changes to the overall view and just get like a feel of maybe what is coming down the road, rather than, as opposed to, I guess, formally requesting every individual change, which could be very, very small, down to like one measure, one property, so on and so forth. A better approach is to accept that there will be a certain amount of fluidity within the consortium, within the members. There'll be like ups and downs, but ultimately, it makes sense from like an admin and time point of view to just kind of hold back until things are absolutely certain. And it is very difficult because I have tried to do that, but things still, I'm like, okay, I think this is definitely not going to change. And then the next day it's like, oh, actually, I think we've got 10 more properties. So, understanding housing providers are constantly exploring opportunities to either backfill or take up additional grant when it becomes available. So keeping changes informal until, as a whole consortium, you're absolutely certain of the picture is advisable. And then finally, we've got a kind of scope document that we have, which is an informal document, and that tags on to the deed of variation. But that's just an individual kind of breakdown of the measures, the properties, the EPCs, the financial profile. So again, it's about having, individual documentation with each provider, but, I guess kind of keeping a really good grip on all of those numbers and all that information, but whilst also, making a sensible decision about when you formalise that, from a DESNZ point of view. Okay, steps for mobilisation. So we're in this period at the moment with wave 3. So this was fresh in our minds. So a few key considerations when mobilisation planning. Obviously, you've mentioned a few times already, but lessons learned, going back and looking at what you're going to repeat, what you're going to change. I'm a big advocate of in-person workshops for planning, so that if that's internally or externally when the time comes with RPs. Thinking about, really basic things, but folder structures, templates, what you're going to reuse, what worked well, just for team organization and task management. And I guess a big one, as I mentioned, project management with technical knowledge. So internal team management and consortium management, there's a lot to consider there about, and plan discreetly, as in, I think initially I lumped a lot of stuff together and tried to do so. Example will be lessons learned, and I was like, you know what, we need to have a lessons learned that's about the project management, and then we need to have a lessons learned that's about delivery and about render and monitoring devices. As I say, in person I think is good. A big kickoff session with all the housing providers is beneficial, and I think as well we're considering extending that wider, appreciating that there is some sensitivity with housing providers and their contractors. Ultimately they are the ones contracting for their projects, and we don't have any say in that, but the contractors are also the people who are going to be providing the information that goes in the reports. So just kind of getting that understanding and widening that kind of invitation list is definitely something we're considering. And developing a delivery model, which more information on the next slide. So this is a learning that's spread, kind of gone from wave 1 into wave 2.1 and is where we're at currently in wave 3. So really considering all the elements of delivery and what services we can offer as a consortium, how we can add value. As you can see on the left, there is the kind of RISE framework, which is provided as an example, and we've kind of used that more as a starting off point for wave 3 and added in all of the things that we know will be needed, all of the things that are in the guidelines for the wave ahead, and all of the things that we found useful. So wave 3 strategic objectives of economies of scale have gone in, capacity building, low carbon heating and innovation, big emphasis on resident engagement, which just increases in kind of importance as the waves have gone on, and also further developing the governance and operational structures to support the delivery of the strategic objectives and the wider consortium strategy required in wave 3. So yeah, I think thinking back to wave 1, I kind of joined a bit halfway through that, but everyone was just kind of learning. But I think now we've got a really good opportunity to upfront plan and say, this is what we think you'll need. This is what we can provide. So it's a lot more structured and it's a lot clearer, I think. So consortium meetings, again, this is kind of like a bit of a kind of basic one, but I think it's really important to lay out how all of the meetings are going to kind of interface with each other and roll up. Obviously, this will depend on individual organisational reporting flows as well. But what we do is have housing provider one-to-ones at regular times. Depends on how many housing providers you've got. We're kind of on like a 6-7 weekly cycle at the moment as a standard. We have for that a standard agenda. We do minutes and actions. Not super formal. I just do it on an email. It's not on like a million logs or anything like that. But kind of using these one-to-ones to be as broad or as streamlined, going back to that kind of tailoring aspect as well. We can have higher frequency of one-to-ones. Some people have every other week. It could just be during a period of time where, they're having some challenges or whatever. Just flex it up or down as you need. So again, going back to this kind of like the difference between the consortium, the RPs for wave 2.1, I had a consortium risk control log, so risks, actions, issues, lessons learned, and an RP one, and kept them separate because there's what may be a big risk for one individual RP might not even make it onto the consortium risk register because, you know, of the size of their project and so on. So it just enables you to kind of have that control and say what does need to be rolled up and what do we just keep an eye on for them. So that's kind of the very bottom layer. And then we have like a monthly project board. So this is for the project sponsors for each individual RP. It is a decision for, a forum for decision making if it's needed. That doesn't happen very often, but we use it a lot for workshops, for feedback sessions, for knowledge sharing, to have guest speakers in. Obviously, there's information that we want to kind of cascade to everyone at the same time. So yeah, I wouldn't say it's like a board in the strictest sense of the word, but it's certainly so valuable to have that time ring fenced each month, and we can use it for whatever. Also, yeah, just I probably mentioned lessons learned about like 20 times in the session, but I've done like mid-year and end of year, generally speaking, each year, and combine it with kind of a bit of a social and a networking opportunity. So December last year, we had guest speakers from the MCS Foundation to discuss the LARA scheme, and the Lilac team from FIRST, which is Public Health and Intervention Response, and talking about the health impacts and benefits of retrofit. So yeah, you know, I know it can be difficult to get time in people's diaries, and don't get me wrong, you know, not everybody turns up in person every time, but I think just giving the space and the opportunity for people to chat informally as well is really important. And then the rest of it is not very interesting because it's our internal you know, kind of reporting and boards and so on and so forth, but right up to, you know, our SPOC from Turner and Townsend, and then obviously Desnes at the top. And just on the right hand side, I've highlighted that it's really valuable to have a good contacts spreadsheet for the housing providers, that with everyone's roles. Obviously, some people probably act in a couple of roles, depending on the size of the RP. But yeah, just so that you've always got for reference who's doing what, who you should be contacting about what. And, you know, there is a little bit of admin to keep on top of that. Don't get me wrong, you know, organizations change and shift all the time. But yeah, a real basic, but keeping on top of it is important. So I've just put in a couple of examples here as well, or agendas that we use, just in case it's useful. I suppose I did want to mention at the beginning of the session that sometimes I think things can be spoken about in quite like an intangible way. So I've tried to put in some actual real life examples of what we do and what we use. Just, you know, it's not groundbreaking stuff, but I'm happy for people to just use them or as an example. But yeah, we don't necessarily cover every single element on the housing provider one-to-one agenda every week or month, but it just helps to have it there as a reminder. Okay, I am going to stop talking for a second and have a sip of water. Pass on to Chris.
Yeah, you got well. Just focusing then on procurement in terms of how we manage our consortium. So the combined authority is bringing a lot of experience of procuring for and managing LAD and HUG programs. So we're currently finishing off with HUG 2, but we've also delivered LAD 2 and the Sustainable Warmth, LAD 3 and HUG 1 programs. So we've got that experience of procuring for those programs and then managing some of the challenges around procurement and delivery. And a key part of that is that we're able to then share knowledge of challenges with PAS 2035, how to procure for the certain roles, trying to make sure there's some independence in that process so that your coordinator has some independence from who's installing, and also experience of the Procurement Act, which is going to have a big impact. But what we recognise, and as Laura's already touched on, is that managing a consortium for SHDF and SHF programs is very different. So we're not in, as a consortium lead, we're not in a direct contract with any contractors, and it's not our stock that we're retrofitting. So what we aim to do is support consortium members to use their own preferred procurement routes, methodology, delivery partners. And each housing provider's got established relationships with different framework providers and also with contractors that they've used before. And often they've built up that experience and trust over successive waves of SHDF and prior to SHDF as well, general maintenance contracts that they've got. And there's a few, I would say, more popular frameworks that a number of the housing providers use in the city region. So we just One of our key roles, therefore, is to make sure that we're signposting housing providers to some of those framework providers. And we're well experienced with the Procure Plus, DPS and frameworks. I know a number of providers use Fusion 21 and Prosper. So there's quite a number of different framework providers out there, and we just need to make sure that consortium members are aware of which organisations exist, how to access them, and some of the benefits and advantages of using different framework providers and different methodologies as well for procuring. So I mentioned there about having that independence in the retrofit process and splitting up some of those PAS roles. But it's really important that housing providers understand that there are different approaches to that procurement process, and we just need to support them with that. A key thing that we're coordinating in relation to procurement, and this is particularly in relation to the SHF Wave 3 programme, is this area-based approach to retrofit. And it's something that's mentioned quite a lot, but it's quite difficult to make it work. So one thing that we're trying to do is to get the Wave 3 funds and the local grant funds to link up. And an initial stage of that is assessing whether the housing providers in our Wave 3 consortium have appetite and capacity to use their Wave 3 contractors to deliver installations to private homes in neighbourhoods where they're already completing work. So that will be fully funded through local grant, but those housing providers would have to be willing to take on the responsibility and some of the risk associated with those works. There's a lot of advantages in doing that in terms of economies of scale, in terms of having consistent specifications of measures in particular neighbourhoods. And you can imagine, in particular estates, there'll be a leaseholder, one side of a semi-detached, and then a housing provider will own the other side. And trying to coordinate the works to those two homes using two different grants is challenging, but as you can imagine, comes with a lot of benefits. So we, as a consortium lead, as someone that operates across the 6 boroughs of the city region, the ability there to try and coordinate those two funding streams and also engage with the local authorities on that front, because ultimately they will have priorities for where they want investment and where they think needs the kind of regeneration benefits of retrofit. Another thing that we're doing on this front is facilitating collaboration, knowledge sharing and capacity building. And that's partly through Warm Homes forums that we've started to run on a monthly basis. And the people that make up those forums are A3 consortium members, but also housing providers that aren't in the consortium, other stakeholders such as academic researchers and technical experts in the field that can bring expertise. And then what we're trying to do is out of that create topics for discussion and bringing the right stakeholders into those discussions. So an initial focus of discussion has been procurement. What we've also done is invited the procurement specialists at each of the housing providers to that session so that we can talk through some of the complications with the Procurement Act, but also make sure that those teams know what to expect in terms of the scale of procurement at some of these organisations. And again, talk through some of the different methodologies and routes for procurement. Next slide, please. Specifically then, moving on a little bit from procurement, another element of our consortium management has been knowledge sharing. So there's the sort of bread and butter stuff, the stuff that really just needs to happen day one. We've got an internal SharePoint just for our staff, and we use Teams Planner to allocate tasks. We found that to be a really, really successful way of keeping track of who's responsible for what, and then being able to tick tasks off as you go. We then have a separate consortium SharePoint where housing providers, the other stakeholders that I just mentioned, have the ability to transfer files securely, which, as you can imagine, eliminates the need for a lot of email attachments and issues around version control. That's the means through which we administered the application for previous waves of SHDF, for SHF Wave 3. We found that worked really, really well, and we're going to take forward some of those lessons for the delivery of Wave 3 as well. So things like sharing slides when we've had consortium meetings and trying to design clever systems so that we've got, one spreadsheet populating from another within SharePoint. just to save a lot of that human labour, potential for human error as well. And I think one more slide from me, Laura, right? Yeah, so still on the topic of knowledge sharing, within SharePoint, what we're trying to do is develop a resource bank. So this, and we're developing it as we go, but essentially what we're trying to do is put together a set of guidance, resources, some that we will develop as a combined authority by collating experiences that we've got and that consortium members have got, others that consortium members themselves will contribute, and then also links to other resources such as those developed by RISE, the National Retrofit Hub, Net Zero Go, and Net Zero Hub in the Northwest as well. And, we think this is a really good way to share learning and an opportunity, particularly for some of the larger, more experienced housing providers, to help to upskill some of those smaller, less experienced ones. It was one of the strategic priorities of the Wave 3 bid that we committed to that upskilling, and this is one means through which we're going to do that. And some of the topics that we wanted to cover really with this resource bank and also with the forum that I just mentioned is procurement, digital monitoring, information relating to different archetype designs, modelling software, innovative measures, low carbon heating, skills, resident engagement and finance, so that you can see there's like a broad, scope for it, and we'll need to prioritize, the elements that are most pressing. And then one thing that we really want to do is set up working groups. So where we perhaps have a particular archetype in Liverpool, how can we bring different consortium members together, as well as those technical experts, to share ideas, share designs for those archetypes, and try and have some kind of consistent approach. And it links back into that area-based approach to retrofit as well. And I think that's all from me, Laura. So back to you.
Thanks, Chris. You know what I've just thought as well as you're speaking, we've put this as value add with regards to SharePoint, but it's actually compliance as well, because it's not secure to be sending things over email. So setting up those SharePoints, again, sounds like a basic thing, doesn't it? But it's actually really important when it comes to, we're talking about like tenant details and things like that are flying around. So yeah, compliance as well. Okay, so the next, could do a breakdown of changes, because for any project, this is obviously a key risk, or I don't know, a huge amount of time ends up getting spent on it. So yeah, the change management process, so differentiating between housing provider changes and consortium changes as the headline, and there is a big difference here. So as I say, I'll break it down. The DESNZ Change Board happens once a month. Submissions in week 1, reviewed in week 4 or maybe 5, depending on the month. As I mentioned earlier, changes can be minor. You can be backfilling one property, one wall type, on or off gas, but ultimately the output's still the same. You get one retrofitted property. And so collating multiple housing provider changes to measures performance properties, things like someone's got 3 more properties they want to include, but another is backfilling 1, another's moving 30 cavity to 20 solid wall. So you basically have to collate all of this information and fill out the spreadsheet, but it's across multiple housing providers. Then you've got to kind of calculate the impact of the consortium cost cap table, but you can't just do this as a whole, because it will flatten the grant allocation across the number of properties and costs. So you have to do everyone's individual one and then kind of like feed it in like that. Obviously providing a commentary as well, justification, explanation, so on and so forth. Then you've obviously got to wait for the approval, which will be a month. Then you've got to update the housing provider scope document. As I mentioned, you kind of got the scope, which then feeds into the deed of variation, which has to go to legal. I don't know about anyone else's legal teams, but they're always like really under pressure as well. And then what happens after that is usually a housing provider goes like, oh, actually that's changed, and I want to reverse it, or I need to change something else, or whatever. So it's a lot of work for what is basically a constantly moving picture. So if I had my time again, I would do it like this. So basically, kind of in an effort to stay agile in the bottom section, which I do anyway. But so regular ebbs and flows of housing provider scope. It's constantly changing. There's so many reasons, and you probably all know already, but just to reel off a few: tenant refusals, significant unexpected remediation works uncovered but not budgeted for. There's problems with data quality, cavities but that are already filled but wasn't registered. Pre-assessments are coming back as EPCC already. Organisational resource challenges, contractor dropped out, we've had that. Contractor failed to deliver, we've had that. So it is just, constantly changing. But the consortium, as in, us and me, I am informally capturing all of these changes, even if they're draft, even if they're just, we think, we possibly might have, another 50 properties or whatever, and just constantly assessing the position of the consortiums as a whole. So what impact, removing some or adding some might have, what grant allocation or additional grants someone might be entitled to, or how much they would have to have taken away, and just having that as a picture, understanding and accepting that it is, not set in stone. And what I would say is, if a housing provider is making a minor change, hold on to it. If a housing provider is making a significant change, but it's a decrease, hold on to it, because they or another housing provider is probably going to fill the gap. And in that case, you can work on a like for like basis and just swap them out. Obviously, there's, for me individually, yes, there's a lot to keep tabs on. It is preferable to do that and, like say, hold it, and then only make that formal change request when you know that that is definitely where things are settling. So what I would do is probably create a consortium change board with relevant stakeholders and, the correct approval level internally to the CA, the sponsor of the provider, the sponsor of the project, finance, legal, so on and so forth, to agree the changes with the housing providers, and so you can get it formalized in the sense of like the scope and the deed of variation between us and them can change. But we're not, Desnes are only really bothered about if we're going to say, we need to hand back £1 million from the consortium, and we're not saying that. We're saying, like, we're backfilling, we're getting pipeline properties in. So that is how I would do it next time. And or maybe people may have experienced similar, but yeah, I would be keen to do that. It would save a lot of hassle and admin. So this is kind of redacted in a way, but this is the kind of a snapshot of the tool I use to plug in all of the changes. So obviously you've got, so I've got all of the housing providers and a line for each change. So this is related to project change request at the moment, but if I was doing it again, I would just name it change 1, change 2, or whatever, just an iteration. And also a breakdown of the key data. So, it's units, it's total cost, total grant, total co-funding, ensuring that those metrics are met, co-funding is more than 50%, A&A is below 15%, so on and so forth. And a line comparing the current changes to the original baseline. So you can always get that sense of, like, have we got underspend? Obviously you wouldn't, I guess it would tell you if you've got overspend, you wouldn't be aiming to do that, but it just gives you that kind of like amount that you maybe have got to play with. And yeah, there we go. At the bottom, it's just kind of showing you in comparison what the changes are. And I've also got one of these for measures and EPCs also. Obviously that's not as, you need that information eventually for a change request, but you're looking at what's the impact on the properties, what's the impact on the grant and the co-funding, the financials is key. So last slide, value add. This is just actually like a bit of a celebration slide of, kind of all the ways in which being part of a consortium is beneficial and what the value is from it. So as I said, we have a lot of like sessions that, where we're facilitating collaboration, whether that's feeding into future plans, sharing kind of like case studies, promotional videos. We've done quite a few of them. Some of them have been led by the providers, some of them have been led by the combined authority, but obviously that gives us like, great promotional material that we can all use and sharing risks and opportunities, lessons learned. We've had lots of in-person sessions where people, this is a kind of easy retro board. Don't know if anyone's used that, would recommend, but so much feedback, so many comments, so many different experiences captured, and people having very different views as well. Some people would absolutely go with external wall insulation every time for their residents. Other people would never go near it again and would only do IWI. So, it's just really interesting hearing of how things differ across different areas of the city region and across different providers. Yeah, like I say, feedback, lessons learned, housing providers coming in with their own kind of case studies and success stories and great videos and great kind of photos and evidence and site visits. So I will end on this slide, which is which is the Mayor Steve Rotherham, on site with one of our housing providers. So yeah, everyone wants the scheme to succeed. So we're here to enable and support and add value, and make things as easy as possible, so that we can all kind of like achieve, the overall objective and spend all of the grant money and deliver all of the properties. Yeah, that brings me to the end.